In the fall of 2008, I participated in a shechita, a ritual animal slaughter. I was living in rural Connecticut and working at the Jewish farming program Adamah. And we were shechting 9 of our goats. It was explained to me at the time that having a dairy business meant that breeding your animals was something that you did on a yearly basis. The female goats would be kept and raised for their milk, and the males would go to slaughter. I can still feel the crisp fall air as we stood in a small cluster around the goats, who would soon become meat. The warmth of the goat I held while its lifeblood drained out. The sense that to hold him tightly and with confidence, especially in this moment, that was as close as I could come to mercy. Life was being transformed into life-giving. I had been a vegetarian for some time, and I was opposed not really to the principle of whether or not to eat meat, but to the way that we do it. It wasn't lost on me that by and large, it was the meat eaters who wanted to look away from the slaughter of these goats. And the vegetarians and vegans amongst us stepped forward to brace, to butcher, to tan, to make use of every part of this life. Our industrial food system allows us to eat life without touching death, which I would say, in turn, robs us of a crucial part of our understanding of nature. 10 years after that fall slaughter, I became a shochetet, certified to kill poultry according to Jewish law, and I also became an ima. And it felt really significant to me that at the same time I was taking life, I was also giving birth to it. In the story of the akedah, the binding of Isaac, the character of God plays 2 distinct and opposing roles. God is both the voice that commands Abraham to sacrifice his son, his beloved, his only, and the voice that stops his hand. When I was still a child, I sat next to my own father, who is with me today, one Rosh Hashanah, actually in this very building. During the reading of Genesis 22, he leaned over to me and he whispered, "What kind of God would demand such a thing?" His question has stuck with me for a very long time. This is a God of paradox, who is both the cause of and deliverer from suffering. How do we make sense of the ways that life both ravages us and is a source of blessing? I carried my second child, Erev Willow, until almost 42 weeks. I kept expecting that she would come sooner than her older sibling, Choni, because this time I was ready. I was in the early stages of labor from week 38 to well into week 41, but nothing happened. And it wasn't until we checked into the hospital and were waiting the final half hour before they were going to break my water that I finally understood what I needed to do. I had been holding on to this baby because to give birth now meant opening myself to the possibility of more love and more loss. At 2 months old, our first child, Choni, went into heart failure within hours of discovering that he had a rare congenital heart condition. He was rushed into surgery, and we were left in the waiting room in shock. Eventually, we were able to leave the hospital after about a month, and we were terrified. We had a newborn who, admittedly, we already really didn't know how to raise, and now he had far more complex set of needs. the sense that his life was in our hands grew very heavy. As we etched new selves out of the wreckage, we also became like nurses. We ran a tight schedule of meds and sleep and bottles of pumped milk. And having come through all of that, I thought I was ready. But now I face the realization that we were actually about to do all of it, or more likely, something completely different and equally hard all over again. Sitting in the hospital gown, I finally found the ability to weep and to hope at the same time. I prayed for God to give us health, even as I knew that sickness would come. I prayed for rachamim, mercy, even as I knew that sometimes the pain would feel too great to bear. And I prayed for courage, because I now understood more than I had before that I would need it, not just for the labor, but for the life that it would bring tumbling into my arms. I finally felt like I understood what Avraham learned that day on the mountain. Life is a precious gift. And in the moments when we experience life at its most precious, we're also profoundly aware that all could be lost. The story of the akedah is remarkable for its sparse language and its unforgettable subject matter. It happens in the space of 19 verses, and God speaks twice in this narrative. First, in a command to Avraham. Vayhi achar hadvarim ha'ele, and it was after these events, ve'ha'elohim nisa et Avraham, that ha'elohim tried Avraham and said to him, Avraham. And he said, Hineni, I'm ready. Then in verse 11, God speaks again, this time through an angel. Vaikra alav malach Adonai min hashamayim. And an angel of Adonai called out to him from the heavens and said, Avraham, Avraham. And he said, Hineni, I'm ready. Just like in our story, the first time that God is mentioned in the whole Torah, it's by the name Elohim. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, Elohim created. Rashi, reading in 11th century France, inquires, why is it Elohim who created and not Adonai? Behind Rashi's question is an admission that these names of God have bearing on the attribute of God the Torah is referencing. A midrash from Bereshit Rabbah contrasts these opening lines of Torah with another description of creation one chapter later, which reads, in the day that Adonai Elohim made earth and heaven. Here, the two names of God are juxtaposed. It's explained, HaKadosh Baruch Hu understood that if they were to create the world with only rachamim, only compassion, sinfulness would thrive. But with din, judgment alone, how could the world stand? Rather, both these attributes are needed. When we translate Elohim and Adonai into the singular English word God, we lose so much of the nuance of the encounter that Avraham has with the divine. Is it possible to understand Avraham in the lead up to the slaughter as having only a partial revelation of God's will? In fact, are there times when you, in your own life, have felt like you had a whiff, a sense of some truth? This is how Rambam, or Maimonides, explains the change from God's earlier and later address. According to his reading, when Avraham hears the angel of Adonai, he experiences a much more complete, much higher level understanding. Again, I ask, are there times when you thought you understood something and then came to a deeper, more whole revelation. Maybe this was at odds with what you initially believed to be true. This journey from partial to complete understanding is a journey we all make in our lifetimes. But as we see in this story, it isn't a journey that we make towards a destination. One of the hardest things about life is that we actually have to make this journey again and again. We continually and inevitably have moments where the chaos and disorder of the universe require us to find the strength to persist, to find a deeper truth that will pull us through the suffering to be reborn into another future. Perhaps if you're used to hearing the powerful refrain, Hineni, translated as, "Here I am," you noticed that I translated it instead as, "I'm ready." One of my favorite darshanim, Leonard Cohen, Zichrono Livracha, sang in his final album title track, "You Want It Darker," "Hineni, Hineni, I'm ready, my Lord." This translation, truer to the Hebrew meaning of Hineni, goes against the grain of "here I am," because the call to presence becomes active rather than passive. In a press conference right before his death, Cohen explained his use of Hineni, I'm ready, by calling it a declaration of readiness no matter what the outcome. Avraham says Hineni 3 times in this chapter. Once to God, Ha-Elohim, once to God, Malach Adonai, and once between these 2 encounters, to his son. Vayomer Yitzchak el Avraham aviv, and Yitzchak said to Avraham his father, and he said, Avi, my father. And he said, Hineni b'ni, I'm ready, my son. Perhaps what allows Avraham to meet God in the deeper truth of staying his hand is his being called to readiness by the other human being in front of him. After all, we don't find truth in isolation, and we don't find God at the expense of others. Rather, we move through the turbulence of existence together, rising to each challenge as they come. When Avraham started up the mountain, I imagine he thought he knew what he had to do. Whether he liked it or not, the God of Din is clear and controlled, often unavoidably so. But as he climbed, and as Isaac called him to awareness, I imagine a much more complex picture emerging. The familiar God who demands your first and your best might slowly, almost imperceptibly, give way to a God who demands that we care for each other, a demand which it can be much harder to believe in. Avraham has long been celebrated for his unwavering commitment to God, but the image I take with me is the moment when Avraham, coming face to face with death, finds a way to transform it into life. Somehow Avraham lets go of the God of control and lets in the God of Rachamim. Amen.